understand binding vows. I'll come out and say it right now. See, my original understanding of a binding vow was they worked a bit like how they work in Hunter x Hunter. If you limit the aspect of a curse technique in any capacity whatsoever, you should make another aspect of that curse technique stronger. Tie this into the idea that risk inherently makes a curse technique or a nen technique stronger, and you have the basic principle of an idea that states if you make something harder to use, it gets stronger. And for a long time, that's kind of how binding vows have worked in JJK. Sure, there's other moments where somebody makes a promise that they'll never use a thing again in order for a massive amount of strength in a certain moment, like Miwa and Gon, but in the last couple of chapters, the idea of binding vows has apparently gone way outside the boundaries of what I thought they were originally supposed to mean. Now, maybe my confusion is coming from the fact that I haven't read an official translation of the JJK manga in almost 3 months, but when considered the fact that the English translator for the JJK manga is worse than fan translations, I don't know what the correct course of action is here. But Nick, why are you talking about binding vows? Sukuna didn't even make a binding vow in chapter 260. And you're right, he didn't. But Todo did, and for the life of me, I cannot understand how it limits him in any capacity whatsoever. In fact, if anything, it seemed to only have made him massively stronger at the low cost of nothing. Now, am I more a fan of the binding vows going in the way of the good guys so we can get back to Jumputsu kaisen and watch Sukuna get these hands? Absolutely. But in a universe so dedicated to the preservation of its own rules and the explaining of its own abilities, one would assume that something as powerful and as important as binding vows would be a touch more consistent. And a lot of you are probably thinking, wow, Nick sure is talking a whole lot about binding vows. That must be the most important thing that happened in chapter 260. Literally not even close. It's a footnote, as chapter 260 not only had Todo creating a binding vow with his new vibraslap hand, but it also revealed that Todo's boogie woogie is not only alive, but thriving. Stronger than it ever was when he had 2 non-toy hands. On top of that, we had Sukuna admitting that it was almost impossible to adapt to Todo's curse technique. Sukuna continuing to compete with Riley Reed for most black appendages ever taken to the midsection. And oh yeah, Gojo might be alive. So to say that a lot happened in this chapter is a serious understatement. However, you can tell this chapter was drawn in a week, because there was multiple times throughout the duration of this chapter where I had to zoom in and squint to see what was going on. But just because we got peak sketchy drawing Gege does not mean that this wasn't one of the best chapters we've had from JJK in a long time. And for the first time in my short career of covering JJK, I have to admit, it may not be Gojover, but it's still probably Gojover. But fortunately, the beauty of weekly released fictional media is that you get to decide if it's Gojover or not Gojover in your beautiful big brain. And it's up to me to give you all the facts, details, and possible theories from this chapter so you can inform your best possible decision as to whether or not it is in fact Gojover. Because today we're talking chapter 260 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me keeping you up to date on all things anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Daddy Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. To get into all that, today we've got to talk about the most important company in my entire life, Flare & Co. See, many of you are probably familiar with this necklace I wear in every single video, and many of you have reached out asking where this necklace is from. This necklace is from my lovely girlfriend Dorothy's jewelry business, Flare & Co., which just a couple of months ago released its unisex line. And with summer right around the corner, I want to make you guys look as good and as dazzling as possible. See, because with summer comes sweat, sand, water, pool parties, all that. And with your standard run-of-the-mill jewelry, you'll probably have to take everything off before you engage in any of those activities. But that is not the case with Flare & Co., as not only is everything on Flare & Co. under $40, making sure jewelry is affordable for everybody, but also it's hypoallergenic, tarnish-free, and water-resistant. I mean, look at this necklace. I've worn it almost every single day for 2 years, and it looks as good as the day Dorothy gave it to me. So if you want to look better this summer without putting a dent in your wallet, Flare & Co. is truly the only option. So help me, help Dorothy, help you. Head to Flare & Co. today and pick up some incredible jewelry for either you or a loved one. So chapter 260 starts directly where chapter 259 left off. No flashbacks. In fact, there's literally no flashbacks in this entire chapter. And there was almost no Gojo appearances. So genuinely rare form stuff from Gege. But the chapter opens up with Todo revealing his new hand. Now I put hand in quotation marks here because his new hand is what's known as a vibraslap. Now for those of you who don't know what a vibraslap is, genuinely fair. It's like a handheld automated cowbell, but instead of a metal cowbell, you got a wooden cowbell. And instead of it being handheld, it is literally jammed into Todo's stub. Now this explains why Todo's hand in the bandage was so large last chapter, because it wasn't a hand. It was an entire percussion instrument. But this raises some logical questions about how Todo was able to evacuate Maki and Ino from Sukuna's domain, because it's revealed during the duration of this battle that Todo made a binding vow that only allows him to use boogie woogie when the metal of his vibraslap hits the wood of his vibraslap. And considering the fact that the entire vibraslap was wrapped up in what appeared to be a very tight bandage, the idea of the metal being able to come into contact with the wood while under that bandage in order to get Maki and Ino out seems kind of unlikely, but it's revealed later on in the chapter that that unlikely possibility might have actually happened. Now, is this a plot hole, or can Todo use the vibraslap with a bandage on top of it? We don't really know currently. But page 2 goes on to explain how Todo's boogie woogie is now affected by the addition of a vibraslap, and basically it covers what I've already told you. Todo can now only use boogie woogie whenever the metal of his vibraslap hits the wood of his vibraslap, which kind of makes a clapping sound. However, page 3 is where the explanation begins to get genuinely rather interesting. See, because while Todo used to be limited by how many times he could clap, in order to switch with somebody that is, Todo now, in order to switch places with somebody, simply has to hit a metal ball that's spring-loaded by the torsion of his stump against the wooden block that it's only an inch from, which means now, instead of Todo needing to do something like this, Todo now instead can just quickly go like that and slap his metal piece against the wood as often as he needs to. On top of that, considering the fact that there's a kink in the metal piece that allows for the vibraslap to be used one-handed, that's its original purpose, and bands and the such, Todo doesn't even technically need to use his fist. He can just shake his arm. And because of this, Todo is now able to use boogie woogie 50 times a second. Hey man, I know we said we could still feel the embers of boogie woogie inside your soul. That seems more like a bonfire. Because sure, maybe if Todo got super into it while he had both hands, he could clap 50 times a second. But the addition of 2 metal prongs coming out of his stump hand has apparently made the usage of boogie woogie infinitely easier. And he shows that off, because on page 3, Yuji begins to close the distance on Sukuna, but just as Sukuna is reacting to Yuji coming up behind him, Todo hits the vibraslap and switches Yuji to the side of Sukuna that doesn't have any hands. And it's at this point that we get our first incredibly hard to read panel. But I believe because Sukuna reacts to Yuji switching locations with Todo, Todo switches them again, and then Yuji from behind Sukuna punches him in his blind spot while Todo kicks him in the face. After which we get a wall of text breaking down exactly how Todo was able to figure out this binding vow with his vibraslap. And basically, what we're told is Todo imposed a binding vow on himself to limit the amount of times he can swap using boogie woogie to the amount of times the metal pieces of his vibraslap comes into contact with the wooden part. Specifically, what my translation says is Todo imposed a binding vow to limit the number of swaps in proportion to the collisions of the vibraslap, which in layman terms means when Todo claps, boogie woogie activates. Super not a binding vow.
Oh, but now this means that Todo has to protect his vibraslap, which is technically just a children's toy at all points.
I mean, I guess, but you know what's a children's toy to the majority of the people that Todo's fighting? A human hand. So basically, to break it down one final time, Todo lost the hand, was supposed to lose boogie woogie because of the loss of that hand, jammed the children's toy into his hand, said boogie woogie's here now, and then got an upgraded version of boogie woogie. But that's not the only upgrade that Todo made to his boogie woogie, as Todo now, through the power of his upgraded boogie woogie, is now able to expand the targets of an individual clap to multiple people, or multiple things. See, when Todo, back when he was a two-handed fool, was only able to swap the location of 2 things, 2 people, 1 thing, and 1 person, but now Todo's able to swap the locations of multiple things simultaneously, meaning that Todo could switch the location of himself and Sukuna and Yuji and Sukuna all in 1 clap. On top of that, as we already briefly covered in chapter 259, Todo has increased the effective range of boogie woogie, which appears to max out somewhere in the capacity of 200 meters, as he wasn't able to teleport Yuji and Chozo out of Sukuna's fully realized domain expansion because they were in the center of it and he was outside of it. It's then revealed by the narrator that these upgrades allowed for Todo to get Maki and Ino outside of Sukuna's domain expansion, which absolutely proves that he did do that. If the narrator said he did that, he absolutely did. I just struggled to realize how he could have done that with a bandage over his vibraslap. Like, I get that it is a possibility that the vibraslap is still usable with a bandage over it. It's just visually weird. Sukuna then on page 6 realizes, oh, I'm getting jumped, and kind of by the worst combination of people I could ever hope for. Sukuna says that out of all of the sorcerers, Todo is the most self-centered and hardest to sway. That is to say, when it comes to breaking the spirits of sorcerers in JJK, Todo is your toughest task, which is corroborated by the fact that Todo has shown up in the toughest of circumstances and every single time brought Yuji back from the brink. I mean, he is, after all, eternal. And thus Todo showing up in this moment when Yuji was just about to break down because of all the people that he had lost was the worst possible timing for Sukuna. And while Sukuna is having this monologue, both Yuji and Todo are in the air coming towards him. And because of this, Todo switches his location with Sukuna and therefore puts Sukuna in the air, hurtling towards Todo, which is an advantageous situation for Todo because Sukuna shouldn't be able to dodge the kick he's about to roundhouse into Sukuna because he's mid-air. Except Sukuna can dodge in mid-air for some reason that isn't exactly elaborated upon, as Sukuna very easily dodges Todo's kick. And to this point, that Todo makes a mental note that Sukuna can dodge mid-air, and Yuji does his best to roll his Chapman impersonation and hucks a rock at Sukuna at roughly, I can only assume, 700 miles an hour. Todo then switches Yuji's location with that of the rock, and Yuji lands a huge missile kick directly into Sukuna's chest. At least I think. It's one of the hardest to read panels I've ever looked at in my entire life. Fortunately, on the next page, we see that yes, Yuji has landed a massive kick into Sukuna's stomach, as Yuji is standing on top of Sukuna, sliding him across the ground like a skimboard. But Sukuna, who's apparently not all that into feet, decides that's enough from you and takes Yuji by the face and throws him. Well, at least he tries to throw him, but Yuji's immediately swapped out with something, it's not really clear what, and thus Sukuna is no longer holding on to Yuji. In fact, Yuji is now behind him, but Sukuna sees this coming and begins to wind up a punch to hit Yuji behind him, only for Todo to once again switch the locations to put Yuji behind Sukuna, and once again, Yuji lands a punch on Sukuna's midsection from his blind spot. And this torrent continues, with Sukuna swinging at ghosts and Yuji popping up in Sukuna's blind spot and landing blows into his midsection. And it's at this point that Sukuna realizes two things. One, Todo now has the ability to change the maximum or minimum amount of swaps per slap of the vibraslap. That is to say that now not only could Todo be switching somebody's location with that of a rock or somebody else's, but now he could be switching 3 things simultaneously, or 5 things simultaneously, or 1 thing. That is to say that now Todo's boogie woogie is even less predictable than it used to be. See, because while the biggest trick that Todo had back in the day with his original boogie woogie is that when he clapped, he didn't necessarily have to switch anybody's location, he now not only has the ability to slap his vibraslap and not switch anybody, but he now has the ability to make 4 or 5 switches simultaneously to make it impossible to guess where Yuji might show up. And if you start anticipating that, oh, Todo's gonna make 3 switches, he can make 1 switch in order to make it simpler than you originally anticipated, tricking you into believing that he's actually making a more complex attack, once again putting you in a disadvantageous situation. And because of this, Sukuna comes to his second realization, that it's almost impossible to fight back against Todo's new and improved boogie woogie. And he's right, Todo now technically has infinite possibilities on the battlefield in terms of strategy. And considering the fact that Todo is one of the most intelligent people in terms of battle IQ in the entirety of JJK, he's gonna use a close amount of those infinite possibilities. And that becomes incredibly apparent incredibly quickly. So Sukuna realizes that trying to decipher Todo's battle strategy is impossible. And thus Sukuna decides to focus on Yuji. See, Todo, while he did technically land a kick on Sukuna and has been involved in the battle in a close, upfront, and personal capacity, is more acting as a support character for Yuji, teleporting Yuji to advantageous situations so that he can land every blow that he throws against Sukuna. And thus Sukuna decides, instead of focusing on Todo, I'm gonna focus on Yuji, as he comes to the realization that whenever Yuji comes to the peak of his focus, that's when Todo is going to switch his location. And thus Sukuna should stop anticipating switches prior to Yuji hitting the peak of his focus. That is to say that Sukuna should only swing behind him when it appears as though Yuji is just about to strike. But still, this realization doesn't save Sukuna in the immediacy, as Yuji blasts him in the stomach into a stone pillar. However, Sukuna, probably upset about the infrastructure damage, launches a dismantle at Yuji, which surprisingly hits. And thus Sukuna comes to the conclusion that Todo may not switch Yuji's location in this next upcoming bout, but rather he'll use his vibraslap to switch the location of something else somewhere. And that way, when Sukuna spins behind him after hearing the vibraslap to punch the Yuji who should be in his blind spot, Yuji will actually remain in the same location and will therefore be in Sukuna's blind spot. And thus Sukuna, who's now convinced himself that Todo will not switch Yuji's location, winds up to punch Yuji about as hard as he can. But just at that moment, Sukuna realizes something. And that something is one of Meimei's crows. And thus Sukuna realizes that his initial deduction that Yuji's location is not going to be swapped was wrong, and that instead that Meimei's crow that just appeared in his blind spot is actually where Yuji is going to show up. And just in that moment, Todo slaps his vibraslap. And thus we see Sukuna begin to turn his body towards Meimei's crow, with the full-powered anticipation that that's exactly where Yuji is about to be. And thus on the next page, we get a double spread page of Sukuna absolutely decimating a crow. I mean, he just juices this thing. And it's at that point, as his foot becomes covered with blood and feathers, that Sukuna realizes his initial deduction was correct, as Todo didn't switch Yuji's place at all. But because of this, Sukuna was now 1 foot in the air with a back turned towards Yuji, who just so happens to be the man blessed by the sparks of black. And thus capitalizing on this moment of having Sukuna's back, Yuji sparks up a black flash and lands it directly into Sukuna's stomach. And it's at this point that Todo lets us know that he concealed the concealment within a concealment, a true 1000 IQ plan. And quite honestly, and I know this is gonna sound crazy, you can't help but feel at least a little bit bad for Sukuna in this circumstance, because genuinely, how do you fight Todo? But Yuji decides to treat Sukuna just like his predecessor Riley Reid and doesn't pull out. That is to say that after Yuji lands this black flash into Sukuna's stomach, he uses his claws and digs into his guts, which causes Sukuna to spit up blood. But as Yuji is ripping through Sukuna's chest with his claws, Sukuna looks down on him, crosses his fingers, and goes to open his domain. Now, for those of you who are saying, how's he gonna do that? Genuinely a really good question. He literally opened a domain probably 2 in-world minutes ago, and it was literally established at the end of chapter 259 that Sukuna was in a state where he wasn't able to use cursed techniques all that well, and while sure, about halfway through this battle, he uses a dismantle on Yuji, which shows that he could use cursed techniques again, but like he literally had to use a binding vow to make his last domain expansion, and the stipulation for that domain expansion was that it would only exist for 99 seconds and that it would have a barrier, if I remember correctly. So to assume that Sukuna somehow has it in him to use another domain expansion after getting black flashed by Yuji, mind you, actually just after getting punched by Yuji a ton. Let's remember the fact that every single time Yuji makes contact with Sukuna, Sukuna should be in theory getting weaker. That doesn't just apply to black flashes. So to assume that Sukuna somehow has enough in the tank after just using a domain expansion and spending an entire chapter getting punched by the person who makes him weaker is kind of presumptuous. And it might have been presumptuous from Sukuna's end, because as Sukuna goes to once again open his domain using Gojo's domain expansion hand sign, mind you, something he's done ever since Gojo's death. Because if you remember correctly, in order to open Sukuna's domain, Malevolent Shrine, he usually has to do this. But to do this hand sign, you need 2 hands on different sides of your body. And therefore, part of the binding vow he made in order to open his domain expansion again also allowed him to change the hand sign he needs to use in order to open his domain expansion. All for the low cost of, hey, I only get this incredibly powerful and super broken domain expansion for 99 seconds. Whatever will I do? I'm so silly. At least the binding vow he made for his Divine Flame stated that he can only use Divine Flame if he's outnumbered, if his shrine is open. Like that's technically a consequence. But like when you consider just how easy it is for Sukuna to open his domain 99% of the time, hardly. On top of that, when you consider the fact that he can combine his Divine Flame with his domain expansion to make everything he eviscerated through the use of his domain expansion basically TNT that explodes when the fire hits it, it's hardly a step backwards. But anyways, while Sukuna is trying to once again open his domain expansion, Sukuna sees a mysterious silhouette. And the narrator then explains that Sukuna has witnessed him, the strongest ghost that he killed with his own hands. And who do you think that is, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it's none other than Gojo, which leads us to our tinfoil hat part of this video, because there is 3 possible and well-vetted explanations as to how Sukuna is seeing Gojo on this battlefield. The first possible explanation is that Gojo is a manifestation of the fear that Sukuna is feeling in this moment. The second explanation is that this visage of Gojo is a consequence of Sukuna breaking a binding vow he imposed on himself. And the third possible explanation is that it is in fact not Gojover, and that Gojo has come back to life by imposing a binding vow on himself in exchange for one of his 6 eyes. And quite honestly, all 3 of these explanations hold a fair amount of merit. So let's get into them in the order we've laid out. And thus the first possibility we need to talk about is the fact that Gojo is not in fact back. That instead of this being the actual Gojo, Sukuna is seeing a visage of Gojo that is the manifestation of the fear he's feeling in this battle against Yuji. But why? Why would Gojo show up if Sukuna was afraid of Yuji? Well, one, if this is the possible explanation, this would be a callback to Sukuna and Gojo's fight. As in Sukuna and Gojo's fight, it's stated that in this battle against Gojo was the first time that Sukuna ever felt fear. And thus, since Gojo is inherently tied to the feeling of fear for Sukuna, if Sukuna is going through the process of feeling fear again as Yuji is tearing into his chest with his claw-like hands, then a good hype-building way to visualize that fear would absolutely be revealing an image of Gojo. That is to say that in this moment, Sukuna is reminded of Gojo as he's battling against Yuji. Now, based off actual concrete evidence from the manga, this feels like the most likely explanation to me. And this is mostly just because of how the narrator explains Gojo reappearing. Because Gojo's reappearance comes with the narrator saying, and I quote, "Sukuna sees a mysterious silhouette. Narrator explains that Sukuna has witnessed him, the strongest ghost that Sukuna killed by his own hands." Now, I believe the narrator not only referring to Gojo as a ghost, but also doubling down and saying the ghost Sukuna killed with his own hands confirms that Gojo is not around, but rather Sukuna is seeing Gojo's ghost because Gojo almost killed him, a situation he is eerily close to right now in his battle against Yuji. But you could make an equally valid and equally compelling argument that the narrator is referring to Gojo as a ghost that Sukuna killed with his own hands because that's what Sukuna would believe in this moment. See, because if Sukuna saw Gojo, the first thing he would think is, no, he shouldn't be here, I killed him. And thus the narrator could just be giving us perspective into Sukuna's mindset. But speaking of Sukuna's mind, it's an important talking point in our second possibility, that Gojo has appeared in Sukuna's psyche as a response to Sukuna breaking a binding vow he imposed on himself. See, we've actually never seen somebody in JJK break a binding vow they imposed on themselves. Because prior to the battle against Sukuna, the only people who had ever imposed a binding vow on themselves was Nanami, who willingly limited his cursed energy output to 80% between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., which allowed for him post 5 p.m. to enter into what was called overtime, where he was able to access 120% of his cursed energy. Now, Nanami never breaks this binding vow, though it is stated while binding vows are being explained in the manga that the penalty for breaking a binding vow that one makes with themselves is the loss of the power they gained through the medium of that binding vow. This is stated in chapter 79 of the manga, or episode 30 of the anime. Now, this isn't technically as bad as breaking a binding vow with somebody else, as Kenjaku reveals to Mahito when Mahito is using his idol transfiguration to give Mekamaru a real boy body, that breaking a binding vow with somebody else is incredibly dangerous and usually deadly. But then, if breaking a binding vow with yourself only leads to the loss of whatever you gained through the medium of that binding vow, if Sukuna broke a binding vow he made with himself during his previous opening of his domain expansion, shouldn't he just lose the ability to open his domain expansion? Yeah, kind of. Those would be the rules as they've been laid out to us. And technically, if binding vow lore is meant to be believed at this point in time, that means that when Sukuna goes to open his domain once again, if he broke the binding vow he originally made, which was, and I'm going to read it out loud because it is quite arguably the most ambiguously worded thing I've ever read in my entire life, a change of palm signs, a cursed technique with part of the brain unaffected by unlimited void, and the operation of a barrier technique. Having survived the black flashes, Riemann Sukuna generates malevolent shrine without a decrease in effective area or output through imprecise elements and an impromptu binding vow. And that binding vow is, even with his back against the wall, Riemann Sukuna isn't lowering the difficulty of his barrier technique. As in Shibuya, he isn't using a barrier to divide his effective range and the outside world, which means that Sukuna's domain expansion is operating like it usually does. You can run out of it. The explanation then continues on by saying, covering the domain with the barrier's external shell provides an escape route. The binding vow disappears, the effective range shrinks, and the domain specifications change. And the guaranteed hit activates within the manifested landscape of mental imagery. That is needlessly complicated. But basically, I believe the synopsis of this is that Sukuna uses a binding vow to activate his domain expansion. He then covered said domain that he created using a domain expansion with an external shell, which nullifies the binding vow he used to create the domain expansion in the first place. But because of this, the effective range and the specifications of the domain change. But he still has the guaranteed hit factor. But since Maki has no cursed energy, she can't be targeted by that guaranteed hit. And thus, this is all an incredibly circuitous and roundabout way of saying that Sukuna can only maintain his domain expansion for 99 seconds, of which he has already done. But this means technically, through the opening of his domain expansion that first time, he broke a binding vow with himself by applying an external shell to the outside of his domain. But then again, I don't really know. They're doing a super bad job of explaining basically everything. But this would mean that Sukuna, by breaking the binding vow he made with himself in order to open a domain expansion, would lose the ability granted by said binding vow, i.e. the domain expansion. And thus Sukuna, who is now trying to open a domain expansion once again using Gojo's hand signs, no longer has access to that ability. And thus, by using Gojo's hand signs and tapping into the part of his brain that controls domain expansions, which was affected by the unlimited void, manifested a vestige of Gojo in his psyche that possibly only he can see. And therefore, instead of opening a domain, he's actually just accessing the unlimited information that Gojo shoved into his brain over and over and over again, which could possibly lead to Gojo being able to mount some kind of psychological attack against Sukuna. But out of all the possible explanations, this one is the most convoluted and by far and away my least favorite. And while I'm not exactly a firm believer in the third possibility, I will admit it would be the most fun. Because the third possibility is that it is not, in fact, Gojover. And somewhat unfortunately, this theory's got some legs. If only because they didn't show both of Gojo's eyes. See, they very clearly only show one of Gojo's eyes. And before anybody goes on and says, oh, that's because the other eye was covered by his hair. No. It wasn't. Gojo's hair isn't long enough to cover his eyes. And while sure, you can make the argument that Shadows covered it and that Gege draws in that style fairly often, and that in this moment Gojo was supposed to be a mysterious silhouette and therefore him being all shadowy wouldn't be the craziest thing of all time, there has been a ton of possible hints of Gojo using a binding vow to get rid of one of his eyes to come back to life. Well, there's actually just been a ton of hints that Gojo would one day lose an eye. See, this is a music video of a song made by the band Eve called Avant, and Eve are the people who made the first intro for JJK. And this entire music video is basically a 4-minute long reference to JJK Easter eggs. And rather interestingly, in this music video, a couple of key things that appear to be references to Gojo happen. The first of which is that there's a fish that gets cut in half with 6 eyes. Now, this is rather clearly a reference to the fact that in the beginning of Sukuna and Gojo's fight, Sukuna referred to Gojo as a nameless fish. Now, this fish, on top of being cut in half in the music video, also has a nail driven into its biggest eye, which I believed while watching the music video was a reference to the fact that Gojo might lose one of his eyes, taken from him in a proverbial sense. As also in this music video, there's an image of Gojo's eyes placed in a frame, and this image of Gojo's eyes falls into the background while chains move around in the foreground. Now, the imagery of chains in JJK is almost always tied to a binding vow, with the most notable of these situations being when Sukuna is explaining binding vows to Yuji. But the chains isn't where the binding vow symmetry stops. See, because not only is there chains flying across in the foreground of this image of Gojo's eyes, but also a black splotch comes in and blots out one of Gojo's eyes, which I and other people believed in that moment was referencing the fact that at some point Gojo was going to make a binding vow at the cost of one of his eyes, possibly to get enough cursed energy to come back to life. But this isn't the only time that Gege has seemed to hint at the fact that Gojo might lose specifically his right eye, as when Gojo fires his final purple in his battle against Sukuna, his right eye is blacked out. On top of that, in Gojo's death scene, we can see that his right eye is beginning to close and has shading marks drawn across it when his left eye doesn't. That is to say that his right eye looks inherently darker than his left, which led many people to believe that in that moment when Gojo was laying there bisected, he was making a binding vow to get rid of his right eye in exchange for enough energy to come back to life. On top of this, there's references to Gojo only having one eye elsewhere in the manga. Like in one of the comedic 0.5 chapters, Gojo's bandage that goes over his eyes has one big huge cyclops eye in the middle. On top of this, whenever Gojo would lift the cover over his eyes, he would only usually ever reveal his left eye, which is also notably the eye which he appears to still have. So the theory that I talked about 3 months ago may be more rock solid than we even anticipated originally. But then again, we won't know until next week. 3 weeks in a row, no break. That's crazy. But I need to hear from you guys. Of these 3 possibilities, which do you believe is the most likely? Do you believe that Gojo is a manifestation of fear for Sukuna? Do you believe that Sukuna broke a binding vow he imposed on himself and is therefore seeing Gojo? Or do you believe that it is truly not Gojover? Tell me in the comments below, and also give me your thoughts on this chapter as a whole. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh, Big Mike is never gonna let this one go.